Captain Jake Morrison had always believed humanity was alone in the universe. For 37 years, he had watched Earth's radio telescopes search the dark void of space, finding nothing but silence and distant star songs. The Global Defense Initiative, where Morrison served as head of orbital security, spent most of its time tracking asteroids and space debris rather than preparing for alien visitors. Morrison often joked with his crew that his job was the most boring in the solar system. Dr. Lisa Martinez felt the same way about her work at the Deep Space Research Institute. She spent her days analyzing rock samples from Mars and studying theoretical alien biochemistry that might never prove useful. Her laboratory walls were covered with charts showing possible alien DNA, structures, and atmospheric compositions for worlds that humanity might never visit. Commander Rick Patterson, her friend from the Space Navy, always teased her about preparing for guests who would never show up for dinner. Earth's military presence in space was modest at best. 12 interplanetary vessels patrolled the solar system, mostly escorting mining ships to the asteroid belt and back. The largest ship, the Defender, carried only 200 crew members and enough weapons to destroy a small asteroid. Admiral Kate Sullivan commanded this tiny fleet from Luna Station, often wondering if humanity would ever need more than traffic control in their little corner of the galaxy. The morning that changed, everything started like thousands of others. Martinez was reviewing data from the Deep Space Monitoring Array when her computer began making sounds she had never heard before. The screen filled with patterns that looked almost like music, but moved with the precision of mathematics. Her hands shook as she realized what she was seeing. This was not random cosmic noise or equipment malfunction. This was a structured signal from the Proxima Centauri system. Within 3 hours, similar signals appeared from 17 other star systems. Martinez called Patterson at Luna Station, her voice barely controlled. "Rick, you need to get Admiral Sullivan down here right now. We are not alone, and we have been lied to for a very long time." Patterson arrived with Sullivan and half of Earth's military leadership within 6 hours. The Deep Space Research Institute had never hosted so many important people at once. Martinez showed them the signals, explaining how each one carried complex mathematical proofs and star charts. But the most disturbing discovery was what the signals revealed about Earth's position in the galaxy. Dr. Amy Foster, Earth's best cryptographer, worked through the night to decode the basic structure of the alien communications. What she found made everyone in the room fall silent. Humanity existed within something called a quarantine zone. Earth had been marked as a developing species and was being protected from galactic civilization by something called the Hegemony Coalition. But the word protected felt wrong when Foster read the technical specifications in the signals. Sullivan ordered every available telescope and satellite to focus on the signal sources. What they found was both wonderful and terrifying. The galaxy was full of intelligent life. Hundreds of species had built cities among the stars and traveled between worlds as easily as humans traveled between countries. Trade routes connected distant solar systems. Massive space stations served as meeting points for dozens of different alien races. But something was very wrong with this galactic civilization. Morrison volunteered to lead the analysis team studying the alien communication networks. Using equipment borrowed from every space agency on Earth, they began listening to the chatter between distant worlds. The universal translator programs, hastily written by Foster's team, could only handle basic concepts, but even these partial translations painted a disturbing picture. References to slave markets appeared in routine shipping manifests. Casual mentions of population reductions were mixed with weather reports. Trade agreements included clauses about harvesting rights on inhabited worlds. Species were discussed like livestock, with breeding programs and termination schedules planned. Years in advance, Martinez found herself studying biological data that made her physically sick. Entire species had been modified for specific types of labor. Their lifespans had been shortened to prevent rebellion. Their intelligence had been reduced to just above animal level. Their bodies had been changed to survive in environments that would kill unmodified beings. Patterson coordinated with intelligence agencies around the world to build a complete picture of what they were discovering. The Hegemony Coalition consisted of 7 dominant species who had divided the galaxy into territories like ancient Earth empires. Younger or weaker species were classified into categories: useful for labor, valuable for resources, or expendable for elimination. The quarantine around Earth was not protection in any sense humans understood. It was a holding pen. Humanity was scheduled for evaluation in 18 months. If they passed the tests of useful servitude, they would be allowed to join galactic civilization as a controlled species. If they failed these tests, they would be classified as expendable resources and processed accordingly. Foster's team intercepted a planning document that made Admiral Sullivan call an emergency session with every world leader. The evaluation would test humanity's physical capabilities, intelligence levels, and psychological compatibility with hegemony control systems. Species that showed too much independence or creativity were considered dangerous. Species that showed too little were considered worthless. But the most chilling discovery came from Morrison's analysis of historical records embedded in the alien communications. The hegemony had been conducting these evaluations for over 500 years. In that time, they had approved only 12 species for controlled membership. They had classified 47 species as useful for slavery. They had marked 236 species as expendable and eliminated them completely. Martinez spent sleepless nights reading the scientific reports from these eliminations. They were not quick or merciful. The hegemony had perfected methods of destroying entire civilizations while preserving their planets for future use. They had weapons that could target genetic markers specific to individual species. They had diseases that could spread through populations with mathematical precision. They had machines that could process billions of bodies into useful materials. Refugee signals started arriving on the 5th day of monitoring. Ships from something called the Kahari were broadcasting distress calls as they fled their home system. Their messages, when translated, spoke of orbital bombardment and systematic extermination. They begged for sanctuary from any species that might hear their calls. Admiral Sullivan made the decision that would define humanity's future. Against the advice of the World Council, she ordered the rescue of any Kahari ships that could reach Earth's solar system. Morrison prepared the Defender and 3 escort vessels for the first contact mission that no one had ever planned for. The Kahari refugee ships limped past Pluto's orbit like wounded animals seeking shelter. Their hulls showed the scars of energy. Weapons and their communications were weak with desperation. As Morrison's ships approached, the aliens transmitted a single message that Foster's computers translated perfectly. "Please do not let us die alone." The first Kahari refugee ship docked at Luna Station 3 days after Admiral Sullivan's rescue order. Captain Jake Morrison led the boarding team, not knowing what to expect from humanity's first alien visitors. The airlock opened to reveal beings that looked like a cross between insects and birds, with large intelligent eyes that seemed to hold infinite sadness. Their ship reeked of fear and death. Dr. Lisa Martinez joined the medical team examining the survivors. There were only 43 Kahari left on a ship designed for 300. The others had died during their escape, their bodies still lying in the corridors where they had fallen. Martinez had studied alien biology for years, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of tending to wounded beings from another world. The Kahari leader, who called himself Elderdek, through a hastily built translation device, showed Morrison recordings of their world's final days. The images were burned into Morrison's memory forever. Massive ships hung in orbit around the Kahari homeworld, firing precisely aimed beams that turned entire cities into glass. The attacks had not been random or hurried. They had been planned with surgical precision to cause maximum suffering. Commander Britt Patterson worked with Dr. Amy Foster to decode more hegemony communications, hoping to understand what had happened to the Kahari. What they found was worse than anyone had imagined. The attack on the Kahari system had been ordered by the Zephyrian Empire because geological surveys had detected valuable quantum crystals beneath the planet's surface. The Kahari people had been classified as an obstacle to mining operations. Elderthek explained through broken translations that his people had offered to share the crystals in exchange for being left alone. The Zephyrians had responded by accelerating their extermination schedule. They wanted the planet empty, not shared. They had no interest in negotiation or compromise when total elimination was more efficient. Martinez watched security footage from Kahari cities as their hospitals were bombed during evacuations. Medical facilities had been specifically targeted to prevent treatment of the wounded. Schools had been hit during class hours to maximize casualties among children. Families attempting to flee had been herded into stadiums and executed by automated weapons platforms. Patterson's intelligence team discovered that these tactics were standard procedure for the Hegemony Coalition. They had refined genocide into a science over centuries of practice. Each member species contributed their expertise to the destruction process. The Draknari Confederacy provided psychological warfare specialists who knew how to break the will of entire populations. The Korthari Empire supplied weapons designed to cause fear rather than quick death. The Vex Collective had contributed something even worse. They had developed harvesting techniques that kept victims alive during the processing of their bodies into useful materials. Elder Vex showed Morrison recordings of Vex facilities where Kahari civilians had been fed into machines that separated their organs while they remained conscious. The Vex considered the terror and pain to be valuable byproducts that improved the quality of their harvested materials. Admiral Sullivan called emergency sessions with world leaders as more refugee ships arrived from other systems. Each group of survivors brought new horror stories about hegemony methods. The Thalian survivors spoke of their leaders being publicly tortured to death for refusing to surrender their cultural archives. The Mahari refugees described how their entire species had been hunted to extinction because their music was considered psychologically disturbing to hegemony citizens. Dr. Martinez established a medical center at Luna Station to treat the steady stream of wounded aliens arriving in human space. She learned to work with dozens of different physiologies, but the psychological wounds were universal. Every survivor suffered from what humans would recognize as severe trauma. They flinched at sudden sounds, wept without warning, and spoke constantly of family members who had been murdered before their eyes. Foster's translation team worked around the clock to document the testimonies of refugees from 17 different species. The stories formed a pattern that made Morrison physically sick. The hegemony did not simply conquer worlds. They studied their victims for months before attacking, learning their weaknesses, their fears, and their most precious values. Then, they designed their assault to destroy those things first. Patterson compiled military intelligence reports that revealed the scope of hegemony operations across the galaxy. In the past 50 years alone, they had eliminated 12 species completely and enslaved 23 others. Their current projects included the harvesting of 3 inhabited systems and the genetic modification of 2 species for use as living computers. The breaking point came when Elder Deck showed Martinez recordings from a Kahari nursery school. The building had been surrounded by Zephyrian soldiers who had forced the children outside. Then they had made the children watch as their teachers were executed one by one. The soldiers had laughed as they explained to the terrified youngsters that this was what happened to species that wasted valuable resources. Morrison found himself staring at star charts showing the locations of active hegemony operations. Right now, while humans debated their response, millions of innocent beings were dying in processing facilities scattered across dozens of systems. The hegemony worked with industrial efficiency, maintaining quotas for elimination and schedules for harvesting that treated genocide like a manufacturing process. Admiral Sullivan received intelligence reports that made her call for an immediate meeting with every military leader on Earth. The hegemony was ahead of schedule in several sectors. They had improved their techniques and were processing entire species faster than ever before. At their current rate, they would eliminate 3 more civilizations before humanity's scheduled evaluation, foster intercepted communications between hegemony commanders discussing humanity's potential value. The reports were clinical in their assessment of human capabilities. They noted humanity's tendency toward violence as potentially useful for military applications. They observed human creativity as possibly dangerous if not properly controlled. They recommended immediate evaluation rather than waiting for the scheduled timeline. Martinez worked with refugee scientists to understand hegemony technology and tactics. What she learned filled her with cold rage. Every weapon, every technique, every method had been specifically designed to maximize suffering. The hegemony did not kill efficiently because they enjoyed causing pain. They killed slowly because terror was a tool that made other species surrender more quickly. The final revelation came from a damaged Kahari data core that Patterson's team managed to repair. It contained personnel files from a hegemony processing facility, complete with performance evaluations for soldiers based on how much fear they could generate in their victims. Promotions were awarded for creativity in torture methods. Bonuses were paid for psychological techniques that made entire populations lose the will to resist. Morrison stood in the observation deck of Luna Station, watching Earth turn slowly. Below, while refugee ships continued to arrive from the darkness between stars. Each ship brought more evidence of systematic horror that had been hidden from humanity for centuries. The galaxy was not full of wonders waiting to be discovered. It was full of monsters who had perfected the art of destroying anything beautiful they encountered. Eldervec approached Morrison with a question that would define humanity's future. Through the translation device, his voice carried the weight of a dying species. Will your people die quietly like we did, or will you fight back against the darkness? Eldervec's question hung in the air like a challenge that would define humanity's place in the galaxy. Captain Jake Morrison stared at the dying Kahari leader and felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. A quiet acceptance that had marked humanity's approach to galactic isolation was cracking under the weight of what they had learned. Morrison's voice was steady when he finally answered, "We will not die quietly." The World Council session that followed lasted 4 days and nights. President Maria Santos argued for diplomatic contact with the Hegemony Coalition, believing that reasonable beings could surely find peaceful solutions to galactic conflicts. Chancellor Robert Hayes pushed for immediate surrender, pointing out that humanity had 12 ships while the hegemony controlled millions. Prime Minister Angela Clark suggested hiding deeper in space, hoping that isolation might protect Earth from the coming evaluation. Admiral Kate Sullivan listened to the debates with growing frustration. She had studied every piece of intercepted intelligence from the refugee ships. The hegemony had never accepted surrender from any species they deemed unworthy of slavery. They had never ignored a world once it was scheduled for evaluation. They had never shown mercy to civilians, children, or anyone who stood between them and their objectives. Dr. Lisa Martinez presented her medical findings to the Council with clinical precision. The torture methods used by hegemony forces were not random acts of cruelty. They were carefully designed psychological tools intended to break the will of entire populations. Species that surrendered early received the same treatment as those who fought to the end. The only difference was how long the suffering lasted. Commander Rick Patterson stood before the assembled world leaders with intelligence reports that painted a picture of systematic horror stretching back centuries. He showed them shipping manifests listing sentient beings as cargo. He read them efficiency reports from processing facilities that treated genocide like a business operation. He played them recordings of hegemony commanders discussing the most cost-effective methods for eliminating planetary populations. The breakthrough came when Dr. Amy Foster presented her analysis of hegemony military communications. Their forces were spread thin across dozens of active operations. They relied heavily on automated systems and the fear of their reputation to maintain control. Most importantly, they had never faced organized resistance from a species they had marked for elimination. Every victim had either surrendered immediately or fought chaotic, desperate battles that ended in total defeat. Morrison volunteered to lead the first reconnaissance mission beyond Earth's solar system. Using technologies salvaged from refugee ships, Foster's team had built a stealth vessel capable of reaching nearby star systems without triggering hegemony detection networks. The mission would gather intelligence about enemy capabilities and confirm the refugee. Testimonies about ongoing atrocities. The journey to the Kahari system took 18 days aboard the modified scout ship Defiance. Morrison's crew included Martinez as xenobiologist, Patterson as intelligence officer, and 12 volunteers from Earth's Special Forces. They traveled in complete radio silence, knowing that a single intercepted transmission could bring the full weight of the hegemony down on Earth before humanity was prepared to fight back. What they found in the Kahari system broke something fundamental in every human heart. The homeworld still burned from orbital bombardment 3 months after the initial attack. Automated weapon platforms continued to circle the planet, firing on anything that moved in the ruins below. The beautiful cities that Eldethek had shown them in recordings were now fields of radioactive glass that would remain toxic for centuries. Martinez documented the systematic destruction with scientific precision while tears ran down her face. Every major population center had been targeted with different types of weapons, as if the hegemony was conducting experiments in efficient extermination. Hospitals and schools showed evidence of direct targeting during evacuation attempts. Residential areas had been bombed with weapons designed to collapse buildings slowly, trapping families inside to maximize casualties. Patterson's sensors detected massive strip mining operations on the planet's surface, where Kahari cities had once stood. Automated harvesters carved through the ruins, extracting quantum crystals from beneath the remains of homes and schools. The hegemony had not waited for the bodies to cool before beginning their resource extraction. They were literally mining through graveyards to reach the materials they wanted. The most horrifying discovery came in the debris field of former orbital habitats. Morrison's crew found dozens of escape pods that had been deliberately targeted and destroyed after launching from the dying stations. These pods had contained Kahari children, elderly civilians, and wounded survivors who posed no threat to anyone. They had been murdered simply because letting them escape would have been inefficient. Martinez analyzed the attack patterns and weapon signatures with growing horror. The hegemony forces had used biological weapons designed specifically to cause maximum suffering before death. They had deployed diseases that attacked nervous systems, causing weeks of agony before final organ failure. They had released toxins that targeted reproductive systems, ensuring that any survivors would be unable to rebuild their population. Morrison recorded everything with the cold efficiency of a soldier documenting war crimes, but inside he felt a rage building that he had never experienced in 30 years of military service. This was not war as humans understood it. This was industrial-scale torture and murder committed against beings whose only crime was existing on a world that contained valuable resources. The crew of the Defiance spent 5 days cataloging the evidence of hegemony atrocities. They found automated factories that had processed Kahari bodies into organic materials for hegemony construction projects. They discovered research facilities where civilians had been subjected to medical experiments designed to test the effectiveness of new torture techniques. They located mass graves where families had been buried alive to save ammunition. Patterson intercepted communications from hegemony commanders discussing their satisfaction with the operation's efficiency. They praised the psychological impact of their methods on other species watching from nearby systems. They recommended applying the same techniques to upcoming evaluations of 3 other civilizations. They treated the extinction of an entire species as a routine business success. The return journey to Earth took place in complete silence. Morrison's crew had seen enough evidence to fill libraries with documentation of hegemony war crimes. They had proof that the galaxy was ruled by beings who had turned genocide into an art form and mass murder into a profitable industry. They had witnessed the aftermath of evil so systematic and complete that it challenged every assumption about civilized behavior. Martinez worked through the data they had collected, preparing reports that would shock the world's leaders into action. She had medical evidence of torture methods that violated every principle of decency she had ever learned. She had biological samples proving the deliberate use of weapons designed to maximize suffering. She had recordings of children's voices calling for help that would never come. When the Defiance docked at Luna Station, Admiral Sullivan was waiting with representatives from every military force on Earth. Morrison's first words set the tone for everything that would follow. They are not warriors or conquerors. They are monsters who have made genocide into a science, and they are coming for us next. The transformation of human civilization began the day after Captain Jake Morrison's return from the Kahari system. Admiral Kate Sullivan stood before the assembled leaders of Earth with recordings that made hardened military officers weep openly. The evidence of systematic genocide was overwhelming, but more importantly, it proved that the hegemony coalition would show humanity no mercy regardless of how they responded to the coming evaluation. President Maria Santos, who had argued for diplomatic solutions just days before, was the first to speak after viewing Morrison's documentation. Her voice carried the weight of a species that had finally understood the true nature of their galactic neighbors. We are not dealing with civilized beings who might listen to reason. We are facing monsters who have perfected the art of extinction, and our only choice is to fight or die. The mobilization orders went out within hours. Every factory on Earth received new production schedules. Every scientist was reassigned to military research projects. Every resource was redirected toward a single goal that humanity had never pursued on such a scale, preparing for a war that would determine whether their species survived or joined. The list of civilizations that had been processed into raw materials. Dr. Amy Foster took charge of the Communications Warfare Division, working with Kahari and Thelian survivors to develop quantum encryption systems that could penetrate hegemony networks. Her team's first success came within 3 weeks when they managed to hack into a Draknari supply depot's inventory system. The intelligence they gathered revealed the locations of 17 processing facilities and the schedules for upcoming elimination operations against 4 different species. Commander Rick Patterson established the War Crimes Documentation Project with refugee survivors from 12 different species. Their mission was to catalog every atrocity committed by the Hegemony Coalition over the past 5 centuries. The evidence would serve 2 purposes: providing intelligence about enemy methods and ensuring that justice would eventually be served against every individual responsible for genocide. But humanity's real advantage was not technological superiority or superior numbers. It was something the hegemony species had lost after centuries of unchallenged dominance, the ability to fight with desperate fury against impossible odds. While the aliens had grown soft from terrorizing defenseless civilians, humans had evolved through constant warfare that had taught them how to turn disadvantage into strength. Dr. Lisa Martinez, now serving as chief medical officer for the war effort, worked with alien refugees to understand hegemony biology and psychology. What she discovered gave humanity its first strategic advantage. The ruling species of the coalition had never faced organized resistance from their victims. Their military doctrine was based entirely on overwhelming force, applied against populations that either surrendered immediately or fought in chaotic panic. Admiral Sullivan appointed Colonel Danny Wright to establish the Human Liberation Fleet. Unlike the massive, slow-moving battleships that the hegemony used to intimidate their victims, human vessels would be small, fast, and designed for hit-and-run tactics. Each ship would carry advanced stealth systems, devastating weapons, and most importantly, equipment for rescuing survivors from processing facilities. The first human warships rolled out of converted automobile factories 6 months after the mobilization began. The ships looked nothing like the elegant vessels in science fiction movies. They were ugly, functional machines designed by people who understood that war was about killing enemies and saving lives, not impressing anyone with beautiful engineering. Captain Lisa Morgan led the first combat mission aboard the destroyer Fury, accompanied by 11 other ships of the newly formed 3rd Attack Squadron. Their target was a Vex collective processing facility in the Ross 128 system, where intelligence reports indicated that over 50,000 beings from 6 different species were awaiting execution. The Vex commanders had never faced opponents who fought back with organized violence. Their facility was designed to process helpless civilians, not defend against military assault. Morgan's ships tore through their orbital defenses like sharks attacking a school of fish. The aliens had superior technology, but no experience using it against enemies who refused to be intimidated. Sergeant Alex Turner led the boarding parties that swept through the Vex facility like a plague of vengeance. Human soldiers moved through alien corridors with the precision of predators who had been hunting each other for thousands of years. They rescued victims who had been prepared for processing, destroyed torture equipment that had been designed to maximize suffering, and captured Vex personnel for interrogation about other facilities. But the most important part of the mission was the broadcasting equipment that Foster's team had installed on every human ship. The rescue operation was transmitted across hegemony space using hijacked communication networks, showing enslaved populations throughout the galaxy that resistance was possible and rescue might be coming. Martinez, working aboard the medical ship Mercy, treated survivors who had been subjected to Vex processing techniques. The aliens had developed methods for keeping victims conscious during the harvesting of their organs, believing that terror improved the quality of extracted materials. Martinez documented every technique while providing medical care, building evidence for future war crimes trials. The psychological impact of the Ross 128 raids spread through hegemony space faster than their military commanders could control. Species that had been marked for elimination began organizing resistance movements. Slaves in processing facilities started sabotaging equipment. Even some lower-ranking hegemony personnel began questioning orders that involved the torture of children. Patterson, analyzing intercepted communications, watched the enemy's confidence crumble in real time. Internal reports spoke of human contamination spreading through their territories. Military advisors recommended immediate action to prevent the spread of what they called resistance disease. Some commanders even suggested accelerating elimination, schedules to prevent more species from learning that fighting back was possible. Morrison, now promoted to Admiral Morrison of the expanding Liberation Fleet, coordinated simultaneous strikes against processing facilities in 17 different systems. Each mission followed the same pattern. Overwhelming force applied against targets designed to terrorize civilians. Rapid extraction of survivors. Complete documentation of war crimes. And broadcast of rescue operations to inspire other enslaved. Populations. The Hegemony Coalition found themselves facing something they had never encountered in 5 centuries of galactic dominance. An enemy that fought not for conquest or resources, but for the principle that genocide was unacceptable, regardless of the cost of stopping it. Human forces bypassed military targets to strike directly at facilities where civilians were being tortured and killed. Foster's communication teams intercepted desperate messages between hegemony commanders trying to understand human psychology. The aliens could not comprehend why humans would risk their own extinction to save species they had never met. They had built their entire civilization on the assumption that self-preservation would always triumph over moral principles. Admiral Sullivan, coordinating the war effort from the heavily fortified Luna Command Center, received reports of successful missions from across the galaxy. Human ships were rescuing survivors faster than the hegemony could process them. More importantly, they were inspiring dozens of enslaved species to join the resistance movement that was spreading like wildfire through coalition territory. The breaking point came when Colonel Sarah Kim led a special operations team into the heart of Draknari space to rescue survivors from their most secure processing facility. The mission succeeded beyond all expectations, liberating over 200,000 beings and broadcasting the operation live to every world in the sector. But more importantly, they captured detailed records proving that specific hegemony leaders had personally ordered the torture of children for entertainment. The evidence Kim's team brought back was enough to make Admiral Sullivan call for an immediate strike against the hegemony core itself. Humanity had spent 8 months learning how to fight a war for justice rather than conquest. Now it was time to bring that war directly to the beings who had turned genocide into a profitable industry spanning centuries of systematic horror. The final confrontation began at the edge of the galaxy's core, where the Hegemony Coalition had built their seat of power on a massive space station called the Eternal Throne. Admiral Kate Sullivan commanded a fleet of over 3,000 vessels, crewed by humans and 47 liberated species, all united by shared rage against the monsters who had ruled through systematic genocide for centuries. The Hegemony Council, led by Supreme Chancellor Vexstar of the Draknari, had gathered there, largest military force in galactic history, to defend their stronghold. 50,000 warships surrounded the core station, backed by automated planet-killer weapons that had been used to sterilize hundreds of worlds. They had ruled the galaxy for over 500 years and believed that no combination of inferior species could challenge their combined might. Captain Jake Morrison, now Admiral Morrison of the 3rd Liberation Fleet, received the enemy's response to humanity's demand for surrender. The message was brief and filled with contempt. You are insects who have forgotten your place in the natural order. We will crush you and use your bones to fertilize our gardens, just as we have done to every species foolish enough to challenge our authority. But this would not be a traditional battle fought for territory or resources. Humanity had spent 10 months documenting every war crime committed by the Hegemony Coalition. They knew which leaders had ordered specific atrocities. They knew which commanders had personally supervised torture sessions. They knew which officials had designed the systems that turned genocide into a profitable industry. Why Dr. Amy Foster's intelligence teams had identified every individual responsible for crimes against sentient life. The massive database contained detailed records of 5 centuries of systematic horror, cross-referenced with personal files, communication logs, and testimony from millions of survivors. This was not a war for conquest, but a mission to deliver justice to beings who had made murder into an art form. Admiral Morrison coordinated the human response with cold precision learned from studying every military conflict in Earth's history. The Liberation Fleet bypassed the massive enemy armada entirely and struck directly at leadership targets scattered throughout the core region. Small task forces led by officers like Captain Jenny Adams and Colonel Danny Wright penetrated deep into hegemony space using stealth technology that the aliens had never encountered. The first phase involved capturing war criminals alive rather than simply destroying their ships. Special operations teams led by Colonel Sarah Kim infiltrated command centers and government facilities, stunning their targets with non-lethal weapons and broadcasting their capture across the galaxy. Each arrest was accompanied by a public reading of charges that detailed specific acts of genocide and torture by Dr. Lisa Martinez, working with former victims from dozens of species, had established mobile war crimes tribunals aboard hospital ships that followed the advancing fleet. The evidence presented at these trials was overwhelming and undeniable. Video recordings of mass executions, medical records from torture facilities, shipping manifests listing sentient beings as cargo, and efficiency reports treating genocide like a business operation. The psychological impact on hegemony forces was devastating. Soldiers who had spent their careers terrorizing helpless civilians suddenly found themselves facing enemies who fought with organized fury and moral certainty. Many units surrendered without firing a shot when they realized they were facing justice rather than conquest. Commander Rick Patterson, analyzing enemy communications, watched their command structure collapse in real time. Hegemony officers were abandoning their posts, fleeing to distant systems, or attempting to negotiate separate peace agreements. The coalition that had seemed invincible was fracturing under pressure they had never experienced before. The turning point came when Captain Adams led a rescue mission to the most horrific location humanity had discovered, a facility called the Final Solution Complex. This system-sized installation had been designed by the Korthari Empire to eliminate what they called surplus populations from conquered worlds. It could process 5 million sentient beings per day using methods designed to maximize terror and suffering. Inside the complex, Adams found machinery that challenged every assumption about the limits of evil. Children had been separated from their parents and fed into automated systems that harvested their organs while they remained conscious. Elderly beings had been abandoned in chambers where they slowly starved while listening to recordings of their grandchildren being tortured. Families had been forced to watch each other die in ways specifically designed to break their spirits before ending their lives. The recordings Adams transmitted from the Final Solution Complex ended any remaining sympathy for the hegemony cause throughout the galaxy. Even species that had benefited from coalition rule turned against their former masters when they saw the industrial-scale horror that had been hidden in distant systems. Admiral Sullivan received the surrender of each hegemony species individually as their governments collapsed under the weight of documented evidence. But surrender did not mean forgiveness or forgotten crimes. War crimes trials would continue for decades, ensuring that every individual responsible for genocide would face justice for their actions. Martinez worked with survivor organizations to establish rehabilitation centers for the millions of beings who had been rescued from processing facilities. The physical wounds would heal with time and medical care, but the psychological damage from systematic torture would require generations to overcome. The Kahari Elderdeck, whose question at first challenged humanity to choose between resistance and quiet extinction, lived long enough to see the trials begin. He attended the sentencing of Supreme Chancellor Vextar, who was found guilty of ordering the extermination of 43 species during his century of rule. With his dying breath, Elderdeck whispered through the translation device, "You did not die quietly, and because of that, neither did justice." Foster's team spent years cataloging the evidence from thousands of hegemony facilities, ensuring that every crime was documented and every victim was remembered. The galaxy would have libraries dedicated to preserving the testimonies of survivors and the records of those who had been murdered by beings who treated genocide like a routine administrative function. Morrison stood on the observation deck of the Eternal Throne, now converted into a memorial for the billions of beings who had died under hegemony rule. The space station that had once coordinated the systematic elimination of entire species now served as headquarters for the Galactic Justice Commission, ensuring that such horrors would never be repeated. Humanity had awakened to find a galaxy ruled by monsters who had perfected the art of extinction over 5 centuries of unchallenged dominance. Their response had been swift, decisive, and guided by a principle that the hegemony had never understood. Some things are worth fighting for regardless of the cost. The war crimes had indeed awakened the wrong species. The hegemony coalition had expected humanity to either surrender quietly or die chaotically like every other species they had encountered. Instead, they had faced beings who understood that justice delayed is justice denied, and who were willing to risk everything to ensure that genocide would never again be treated as an acceptable solution to political problems. The age of systematic extermination was over. The age of justice had begun. And in the darkness between stars, species that had lived in fear for centuries learned a new word in dozens of languages: hope.